Cyclones are common weather systems in the north of the state. However, the severity of their impact is dependent on a combination of their size and location. To better understand the risk and potential impacts of cyclones, we talked to Andrew Burton from the Bureau of Meteorology and Alan Gale from the Department of Fire and Emergency Services.
Tropical cyclones are one of the most awe-inspiring and dangerous weather systems that we have in the world. They're weather systems that span several hundred kilometres. They start out as tropical lows, and then if the conditions are right and thunderstorms can keep forming near the centre, they'll start to spin faster and faster until they can produce very intense wind speeds. People hear about hurricanes in the United States and typhoons in the Northwest Pacific, and we talk about tropical cyclones here. They're all the same weather phenomenon, they just have different names. So when you hear of a hurricane or a typhoon, that's exactly identical to a severe tropical cyclone. So we use a category system, category 1 through 5, and that gives us a good indication. It's a way of conveying the wind intensity of the system. Category 1 and 2, we just call it a tropical cyclone. But once we get up to categories 3, 4 and 5, these are the systems that we call severe tropical cyclones, and they are exactly the same as a typhoon or a hurricane. Tropical cyclones can affect almost every part of WA, but the area of the coast between Broome and Exmouth has been referred to as Cyclone Alley, and it's the most cyclone-prone part of Western Australia. In fact, it's the most cyclone-prone part of Australia, receiving more cyclone impacts than anywhere else in Australia by far. On average, every year we see 2 cyclones cross that stretch of coast, with one of them being severe. Now, that may not sound like a lot of cyclone impacts, but it only takes one severe tropical cyclone to cause a devastating and lasting impact on a community. Cyclones typically occur between the 1st of November and the 30th of April, but within the cyclone season, the risk is not equal at all times. The risk in November is actually quite low for communities, but as we go through the season, the risk increases, and it peaks in around about late February through March and into early April, and this is the period where we have the greatest risk, particularly of severe tropical cyclones. One of the notable aspects of cyclones in WA is that they can form very close to the coast. In many other parts of the world, when cyclones form, they tend to form a long way out in the ocean, and they can be tracked for several days as they're coming in to threaten communities. Unfortunately, here in WA, we have areas where cyclones form very close to the coast. In fact, we can see lows coming off the land, rapidly developing into tropical cyclones, and then coming back to threaten communities. This makes it difficult for us, firstly, to provide adequate warning to communities, but it also makes it difficult for emergency services and communities to respond appropriately, because they need to respond to this threat before there's actually anything that you can see on a satellite picture that can give you a real, tangible sense of that threat. Another interesting aspect about cyclones in Western Australia is the threat to the southwest of WA. Cyclones, as they move away from the equator, generally encounter cooler waters and strong winds high up in the atmosphere that will weaken them. And so they come towards the south of the state and they bring flooding rains perhaps, but no wind damage or any other associated hazards. Occasionally though, and this is quite a rare phenomenon, but again a very dangerous phenomenon, we can see very severe tropical cyclones, typically towards the end of the season, that start to come towards the south of the state, and they interact with large cold fronts. And they then combine, and we get this hybrid weather system that's neither a cold front nor a tropical cyclone, but has the energy from both of them. Many people will be familiar with the Hurricane Sandy and the devastation that caused in New York in 2012. That was a classic example of one of these hurricanes, which is a tropical cyclone, a severe tropical cyclone, interacting with a cold front. But for those of us that are over 45, let's say, and have lived in WA for a long time, we'll remember Tropical Cyclone Alby. That was another classic example of a tropical cyclone combining with a cold front to produce a very dangerous weather system. And Tropical Cyclone Alby stands out in the history of southwest of WA as one of the largest weather impacts we've suffered in recent times. Tropical Cyclone Alby started out as a tropical cyclone on the 28th of March 1978. Started in a typical sort of manner for a tropical cyclone. It was well off the coast initially from Broome, trekking down towards the southwest, stayed well away from the coast until it got to a point 1,000 kilometres to the west of Exmouth, so still a long way from the coast. But at that point, it started to interact with a large cold front and started accelerating down towards the southeast, towards the southwest corner of WA. By the 2nd of April, Tropical Cyclone Alby, now beginning to become one of these hybrid weather systems, was racing towards the southwest corner of the state. And as it came towards us, it accelerated, it was travelling very fast and was producing very strong winds and a very significant storm tide. Tropical Cyclone Alby on the 4th of April produced huge sand and dust storms. There were vehicle machinery that was left out in paddocks was just completely stripped back to the metal by blasted by the sand. We saw salt and dust accumulate on the power lines and cause widespread power outages. We saw trees being felled and bringing down power lines. And we saw fires being fanned by these winds that raged over thousands of hectares and caused several deaths. Tropical Cyclone Alby produced wind gusts in excess of 130 kilometres per hour over many parts of the southwest. In fact, a wind gust to 150 kilometres per hour was recorded down in Albany.
The most typical impact from cyclone events in WA is really from the destructive winds, which cause damage to our buildings, to residences, to our infrastructure. But associated with the cyclone, of course, is lots of flooding, a huge amount of flooding actually with the rain that comes with it. Also coastal inundation. The big one that worries most of us is the storm surge effect, which can happen, and of course the dangerous seas. So the most obvious one, of course, is the destructive winds, depending on the intensity of the cyclone. But even with a cyclone that's not that intense, could still bring an extreme amount of flooding. And the further that a cyclone event goes overland and continues overland, then the more flooding you can get associated with it. But the one that has cost lives in Western Australia is usually those associated with winds or with the dangerous seas. So with the cyclone, the less known impact in Western Australia in particular is probably storm surge. The reason behind that, if we look at world figures, we probably see that more deaths have been caused from storm surge associated with cyclones in places like India, for example. Western Australia's been quite fortunate that we haven't had a lot of significant storm surge impacts. It's not to say that our communities haven't had those. With just about every cyclone that comes across there's always a storm surge, but if it arrives on a high tide, then the impact is going to be much greater. Now, if people ignore the fact that the storm surge is going to impact their homes and decide to stay there, then if we're not careful, we'll lose lives. The greatest area of impact in Australia, actually, from a tropical cyclone is known to be between Broome and Exmouth, basically. We do hear of quite a few significant impacts on the eastern and northern coastlines as well, but we know that statistically we're going to get about 5 cyclones a year off the West Australian coast. We know that there's going to be 2 of those which cross the coast, and one of those is going to be a severe cyclone. That tells us that somewhere between Broome and Exmouth there's a community that's going to be impacted, and impacted quite significantly, not just by winds, but by that coastal inundation, by flooding, and we're going to have the dangerous seas. We know that lives have been lost due to those very dangerous seas. We know that lives have been lost due to winds. We know that lives have been lost due to flooding in Western Australia. Our biggest concern, of course, is that lives could be lost from storm surge, and that could be many lives if people choose not to heed the warnings and not to be well prepared. We know the most likely spot for a cyclone to cross or impact would be between Broome and Exmouth, but it's not unusual for a cyclone to come around the Cape and to affect the West Coast. West Coast cyclones are particularly dangerous because our communities aren't as prepared, aren't as resilient. Even building standards as you come further south differ in relation to cyclones. So, albeit that a cyclone may lose some of its intensity as it comes further south, when it does impact on a community, it can have quite a significant impact for a whole range of reasons. Hence, the planning is just as important, if not more important, for those communities further south. The strength in our northern communities is that they do appear to be far more resilient when it comes to dealing with an approaching cyclone. There's not a lot of people that are actually experienced a cyclone and and coped and dealt with it. So it's a whole new experience, and people need to be ready for that, of course. The other thing we find too is with a tropical cyclone that moves inland and continues to move for a long way and eventually becomes a rain-bearing depression, can cause significant flooding right from the very north of the state to the very southern part of the state. And when you get an event like that, that infects just about every part of Western Australia, that can have a significant impact on our resources, on our ability to respond, and certainly we find costs in those particular occasions are quite extreme, because so much infrastructure is affected, our roads, so many mines actually get filled with water, so many things happen. Railway lines get washed out, it impacts transport. So those bigger events mightn't be a big wind event in the north, but it becomes quite a rain-bearing event. So a well-prepared community goes right down to the individuals who are self-contained, who can actually look after themselves, who don't rely on services to come and look after them. That enables those emergency services to go and deal with other more pressing problems, but just by having a kit at home, a survival kit, knowing what the likely impact of a cyclone is, those sort of things make the world of difference. Being able to go somewhere else, being able to move quickly and go somewhere else and out of the path of a cyclone is the most obvious thing to do, but not if you're going to be putting yourself and your loved ones at risk.
When we look in the cyclone records, we can't find a discernible trend in the records to date, but we only have a very short period of reliable records, really since the satellite era, since we've been able to observe all the tropical cyclones with satellites. So when we look at that record, we don't see a discernible trend. But when we look at the science around climate change, what can we say about the likely change with cyclones? Well, globally we can say something. Globally, the science is telling us that it's most likely that the actual total number of cyclones will slightly reduce, which is good news. Unfortunately, we expect that the intense storms will become even more intense. But that doesn't really give us a lot of certainty about exactly what's going to happen in the West Australian context. That tells us about what's going to happen over the whole globe. And I guess the most important thing to remember is that we're already an area of the globe that is very exposed to tropical cyclones. So we need to be prepared now, and one thing is for sure, we are going to need to remain prepared into the future.